Welcome to Talk Travel with Heather Tate, North Mississippi's podcast for savvy travelers. Talk Travel with Heather Tate is a weekly podcast that airs every Monday on the Shark 102.3 FM radio station based in Ripley, Mississippi, and is then released as a podcast. Travel advisor and travel enthusiast Heather Tate of Whimsical Destinations gives listeners expert travel tips curated through the years of personal and professional experience. By clicking subscribe, you'll have a new travel tip to add to your collection delivered to your podcast library every Monday. Talk Travel with Heather Tate is brought to you by Sun Bear Studio. Sun Bear Studio is a boutique recording studio in the heart of Ripley, Mississippi. When you record with us at Sun Bear Studio, we can mix, master, register, and publish your music, your podcast, or your family story. Email us when you're ready at sunbear@jc.media.
This program was recorded at Sun Bear Studio in Ripley, Mississippi.
Good morning, Northeast Mississippi travelers. This is Heather with Talk Travel with Heather Tate, and I'm so excited to share my adventures and tried and true tips with you. Whether you are also a seasoned traveler, a hopeful traveler, or currently an armchair traveler, meaning you're going to follow along with us from home for now. This is our 105th episode of Talk Travel with Heather Tate, and this week I'm going to talk to you all about our trip to Niagara Falls. Now, really, this is going to be a three-part segment. And the first one, I'm just getting right to it. I am focusing on Niagara Falls itself. I love waterfalls. Niagara Falls has been on my list for years. Both of my parents have been, my grandparents have been. I knew when I went that it was going to be amazing, but it's like the time was never right. I wanted to make a big road trip about it. I have booked Niagara Falls for clients before in the past. I had some go last fall, and at that point I was like, you know what, I'm just going to make this happen. We are going to do it. With all the research that I was doing for that trip, I was like, we are going to make Niagara Falls happen. And how this developed was my best friend, Amanda, turned 40 on June 22nd, and she lives in Ohio. And I knew that when I always said that the first time I would go to Ohio would be on my way to Niagara Falls because that's the way I was going to drive. Well, really, we went to visit her and her husband whenever they first moved to Ohio a few years ago. So I had already knocked Ohio off of my list of my 50 states that I'm going to visit. So I had already been to Ohio, but I was like, okay, it's still a good halfway point. So if we go to Ohio, we can incorporate visiting Amanda for her birthday. And then I told her what we were planning on doing, that we were going to go to Niagara Falls. And she's like, I've never been to Niagara Falls. Her husband had never been to Niagara Falls either. So no one in our group, with Logan and London and Christian, Amanda and Andy, had been to Niagara Falls, and that's how this started. We're like, okay, for Amanda's 40th birthday, Niagara Falls it is. And I knew I wanted to stay on the Canadian side. Now, there's a lot to see, and you can still do a lot on the American side, but I had just heard over and over again that the Canadian side is the side you want to stay on, and I love Canada. So I was like, well, that was easy for me. I started researching hotels because my number one thing is I want a view of the falls from my room. And I started surfing the web. I was looking all over Instagram and, TikTok and Facebook, and I found the hotel that I wanted to stay at. And I'm going to share all these tips with you because if I'm honest, this is not a trip that I book very often for guests. I don't do a lot of domestic and FIT type trips currently just because I am so busy with what are my priorities and my specialties, which would be the Caribbean. But I wanted to have this experience, and so this is how I'm contributing them for all my clients and my listeners. Like, I will go share with you what I learned, and that can help you as you're planning your trip. So I always thought Niagara Falls was one large waterfall. And if you've never been, or if you're like me, like you hadn't really even thought much about it, that Niagara Falls is one fall, you might have thought that too until you've been there. It's actually 3 large falls instead of 1. 2 are on the American side, which is why then if you're staying on the American side, the way it's positioned, like they're actually the border between U.S. and Canada. You cannot see the falls as well from the American side. There are not hotels overlooking the falls on the American side like there are on the Canadian side. We were overlooking Horseshoe Falls, which is the gigantic, half circular shaped falls. We stayed at the Hotel Marriott Falls View. Now, this is very important because even on the Canadian side, when we stayed in Niagara Falls, Canada, in Ontario, there are 2 Marriotts, and the Falls View one is a little bit closer to the falls. So we made sure to get a room that has a falls view and an upper floor. These are all things that are important when you're booking. We had incredible views. I will say the sunrise over the falls where it looked like I was right there overlooking it. If you haven't seen our pictures on our Facebook group, you definitely want to check it out. It was one of the most amazing experiences to walk in and just go straight through and just see the falls. Depending on the size of your room, you may have your bed that's overlooking the falls. The way our room was, because our boys were with us, we had a sitting area there. So we had 2 queen beds in a room and we had the sitting area. We put together a puzzle of a waterfall overlooking the waterfalls. Like, it was a great place to have morning coffee. It was beautiful. And again, like I said, the sunrise with the mist coming over up over the falls was amazing. We went in June. The temperature was wonderful. So if you're planning on going, you want to really look at the month you're wanting to go, what the temperatures will be. In the evenings, it could be in the 60s. It never got over the 80s. I believe a lot of the time it was like upper 70s. So weather-wise, it was wonderful. In the summer, it's going to stay light most of the day. They do nightly fireworks there at 10 p.m. And the reason it's not until 10 p.m. is because that's when it is dark enough to have the fireworks. And the sunrise was by like 5:30 in the morning. So you have a lot of daylight to do a lot of things. One thing I would want to prepare you for that I was not as prepared for as I should have been was how expensive the food was going to be in Niagara Falls itself. Now, I know touristy places are going to be more expensive, right? We know that. In Canada, the food cost was higher. We ate at an IHOP overlooking the falls on the 25th floor. Absolutely most amazing view I will ever have while eating pancakes. Absolutely the most expensive pancakes I've ever had in my life as well, and they were from IHOP. So keep in mind, food cost, we were there, we stayed for 2 nights. And because we knew part of our road trip, we were gone on our trip for 7 days, but we were only 2 nights in Niagara Falls. Was that enough time? We could have done an extra night, but I wanted to go on to where we're going to talk about next week, which was Niagara on the Lake, and I wanted to dedicate a night and a day there. So could we have done 3 nights? Yes. Did we get to do a lot in the 2 nights we were there? We sure did. And like I said, we drove. You could fly. A lot of people were going to fly to Buffalo. My clients who were staying on the American side normally fly into Buffalo. You could also fly into Toronto if you're wanting to stay on the Canadian side, but you could even stay on the Canadian side if you fly into Buffalo. Then you have to think about, like, well, how are you going to get there? Are you going to rent a car? Are you going to do a bus transfer? So there's options, but we just wanted to keep it simple and we drove. One thing you should know staying in the Niagara Falls area is parking is extremely expensive. So if we were to drive down from where our hotel was to where a lot of the restaurants were, a lot of the walking area, then it was going to be like $25 an hour for some of the parking there. So we learned pretty quickly we were just going to leave our car where we were, although it was a very high nightly price to keep your car parked there, whether you did valet or not. We decided we would walk most places, and everywhere in Canada where we walked, we felt safe as we were walking. It was very clean, flowers everywhere, absolutely beautiful walk. We discovered the incline, which was right at the base of our hotel, made it really easy to get down to the falls area where we could walk. And we did a day pass. Looking back, I would have done, if I were going to be there for 2 full days, I would do that incline every day. And just that would be how I got down to the falls area instead of walking. Our first night when we were there and we walked to dinner, and we went to, it's called the Secret Garden. We walked about 35 or 40 minutes because Logan was like, we're already paying for our valet. I'm not going to go pay to park there. We're going to walk and we're going to explore. And that's what we did. But then we learned, like, okay, we could have taken that incline. It would have been a lot easier on the way back. Oh my goodness, I have so much more I want to share with you about what we did and we experienced those 2 days, but there's just not enough time on the radio show. So you'll want to tune in for the full version of this on my podcast. It'll be released later today. That's it for this edition of Talk Travel with Heather Tate. Tune in every Monday at 11 a.m. to turn your travel dreams into travel plans. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion for an interview or for access to this interview, go to our website, shark1023.com, and click on the podcast tab. This interview can also be found on Apple, Google, and Amazon Podcast. Keep it tuned to the Shark 1023 and start planning your next trip.
This show is made possible by JC Media, LLC in Ripley, Mississippi. JC Media owns the Shark 102.3 Classic Rock FM radio station where the show is hosted, and Sun Bear Recording Studio where the interviews are recorded. We need your feedback and support. If you listen to the podcast on a player like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Amazon Music, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review. We also have an email in which you can share your feedback. That email is theshark1023@gmail.com. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite app or stream episodes online at shark1023.com/podcasts. Today's episode was produced by Melinda Marsalis. It was edited by Rick Williams and engineered by Chris Marsalis. The podcast technician is Joyce Grady.